Most medical professionals would agree that the ability to help and heal others was a huge key factor in their career decision. Countless lives have been saved by the work of these great men and women. Unfortunately, not every doctor or nurse carried good intentions in regards to the ill. Throughout history, many people walked down a dark path and instead of saving lives, chose to take them instead. Number 5. This doctor, Thomas Cream, earned the eerie nickname, the Lambeth Poisoner, when he was suspected of purposefully taking his patients' lives, in addition to the lives of 2 women he had impregnated. His life began in Glasgow, and he succeeded in every part of his life, becoming a charming social butterfly with a high IQ and impressive certifications. After medical school, Thomas earned licenses that allowed him to work as a physician and surgeon, 2 aspects he would later use in taking lives. He eventually moved to Canada, where he started a practice. Thomas was dating a woman named Flora Brooks in 1876. After a passionate night, Flora got pregnant. Apparently, neither parent wanted the baby, so they performed the necessary procedure to remove it. Medicine wasn't as well mastered as it is now, and a surgery like this stood a huge chance of taking the life of the patient. In the process, Flora almost didn't make it. A short time later, she passed away from what Thomas described to be consumption. Later down the road, this case would be pinned on Thomas as the most likely guilty party, although he was never charged for it. In 1879, a similar situation played out with his lover Kate Gardiner, who also got pregnant. Her remains were found just a few weeks after the news. She'd been dumped behind the local medical office where Thomas worked. The cause of her passing was confirmed to be chloroform poisoning. Thomas was the key suspect in the case, and he was even accused for some lesser charges related to blackmail. Instead of facing the law, he fled to the USA and started his own practice in Chicago. Thomas opened a small practice there in mid-1890, where he performed surgeries necessary to end pregnancies. He chose to work close to the red light district, and many of his patients were undocumented due to their lack of identification and insurance. While working in this clinic, at least 3 women lost their lives while under his care. Each case didn't hold enough evidence in court against Thomas for the law to make a move. Thomas met a woman named Julia Stott around 1881, and the couple sparked a secret affair behind her husband's back. Julia allegedly aided Thomas in his crimes by purchasing special poisons and chemicals off the black market. One of those doses was specifically meant for Julia's husband, Daniel. Julia and Thomas were both arrested for the crime. Julia made a deal with the prosecutors in which she handed over all the necessary evidence in exchange for a lighter sentence. Thomas, however, faced trial and was sentenced to life in prison. Of course, his sentence would later be shortened after his brother begged the deciding judge to provide leniency. Some rumors also imply that this judge possibly accepted a bribe and Thomas was released in 1891. After his release, Thomas moved to London and continued his crime spree under the guise of a caring health professional. At least 5 more women lost their lives in horrible ways at the hands of Dr. Thomas Cream. As these crimes went down, Thomas followed up by writing letters to law enforcement officials in which he pointed the blame at pharmacists, nurses, and coroners. These letters caught the attention of local law enforcement, and after they learned of his criminal past in America, they put him under heavy surveillance. After enough evidence had been piled up against Thomas, he was arrested and charged with various crimes, including the loss of his victim's life. He was sentenced to execution, which was carried out in November of 1892. Number 4. Michael Swango was an American doctor that played a role in taking the lives of his patients. His crimes began when he was an intern in the mid-1980s. To his colleagues and patients, he was an average physician that dedicated his life to healing the sick. Over the course of a few years, his peers grew suspicious as they noticed his patients were passing away at an abnormal rate. As was shared by other doctors, the patients would come in for minor complaints and ailments. While under his care, they grew sicker and sicker, and most of them passed away. His peers tried to take a stand and bring attention to the shocking data, but it's notoriously difficult to confirm crimes in the medical field, especially after the patient has passed. An investigation did eventually develop, but unfortunately, not enough evidence was collected and the court couldn't convict Michael for any of the alleged crimes. They did, however, ensure that he could not receive a surgical license in the entire state of Ohio. This pushed Michael to pursue other career paths. His next big career move placed him as an emergency medical technician. It's unclear if any victims were taken during his time with the ambulance company, but something even more disturbing did occur. Michael was seen as a friendly coworker because he frequently showed up to work with coffee and snacks he had prepared for his colleagues. The nice gesture was thankfully accepted at first, but in time, his peers began to realize that every time they accepted something from Michael, they would fall violently ill. Although the signs were initially overlooked, everyone slowly came to terms with the possibility that their coworker and friend was trying to poison them. The issue was brought to the law's attention, and a few quick tests determined that Michael had been lacing the goodies with arsenic in an attempt to fatally poison his victims. Michael went to trial for the crimes and was somehow lucky enough to only serve 5 years in prison. Once he was released, he made an attempt to have a normal life after he apparently fell in love with a nurse named Kristen. Their relationship was normal and healthy to outside eyes. It didn't take long before Michael was up to his old ways and he started trying to poison his lover. She spent a significant period of time hospitalized for her sudden fall in health. These actions later resulted in Kristen taking her own life after she learned the truth about the man she thought she knew so well. During the transition period of Michael poisoning his girlfriend, he'd also created forged paperwork and licensing that allowed him to return to work in a hospital. During his time there, many of his patients lost their lives as so many others had before. This time, the rate at which his patients were passing away became too overwhelming to ignore, and Michael was finally arrested for his true crimes. He tried to flee to Africa but was tracked down and faced a hefty trial. It was suspected that Michael was responsible for taking up to 60 victims' lives. However, he was only found guilty of 4 of those cases due to a lack of evidence. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, which began in 2000. Number 3. This criminal wasn't a doctor or a registered nurse. He was nothing more than a simple orderly, but his access to the medical field is what provided him with victims. Donald Harvey was a nurse's aide, an orderly that worked at various health institutes throughout his life. Specifically, Donald was in the business from 1970 to 1987. It was during this time that Donald gave in to dark desires that had long filled his heart by taking the lives of innocent patients in his care. He was described as a kind man with a gentle touch by those that had not yet learned of the disturbing truth behind his work. At the ripe age of 18, Harvey started working at the Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. This was where most of his crimes took place. In the first 10 months of working there, he took the lives of at least 12 people, according to his own later confession. He stated at first that he only did these horrible things out of sympathy for those that were suffering. However, when this investigation and ultimate trial took place, he admitted that he hosted an unexplainable dark anger toward the victims and took their lives to satisfy those rages inside of him. In March of 1987, after 17 years of horrible crimes, Donald's secret was discovered. A patient named John Powell was in Donald's care for many months after a tragic car accident put him in a coma. Despite living fine on life support, John suddenly passed away one day for reasons doctors couldn't identify. The next logical step was to perform an autopsy, which showed that John had a shocking amount of cyanide in his system. Investigators took a deeper look into the hospital staff and found that Donald had been fired from a previous position for stealing body parts. When he was confronted, he confessed. Although officials were happy to accept his confession, a passionate reporter thought it was odd that Donald had worked in the field for that long and had never taken a life before that day. This, of course, sparked an even deeper investigation into Donald's past. It was discovered that he was responsible for up to 87 crimes in the hospital. He used various methods, such as covering the victim with a pillow until they stopped breathing, adding fatal amounts of medication to their IVs, and using arsenic and cyanide to poison patients. Donald finally faced trial in August of 1987 and was found guilty of at least 24 cases of taking his victims' lives. He was sentenced under a plea deal to 3 consecutive life terms. In March of 2017, Donald passed away after his cellmate attacked him. Number 2. Jane Toppin, also known as Jolly Jane, was an American nurse that took the lives of her patients from 1895 to 1901. She claimed to have directly caused the passing of at least 31 victims. Jane was born in Onora-Kelly, Massachusetts in 1857, and went on to have an average childhood at first. While she was still very young, Jane's mother passed away and her father grew mentally ill, commonly being described as crazy or a nutcase by the medical system. Little Jane was eventually adopted by a caring and wealthy family and took on the last name Toppin. According to some sources from the time, Jane was emotionally unstable as a child and teen. She had difficulty processing her feelings, especially anger. It can also be assumed that during that time, she started to play out fantasies she had of doing evil and taking lives. Once she was old enough, Jane enrolled in nursing school at the Cambridge State Hospital. After completing her training, Jane showed no interest in working at a practice or hospital, and instead she found work as a private nurse. While in the field, she began taking the lives of her patients by administering lethal doses of poison. In 1895, Jane poisoned 2 landlords that oversaw the unit she was living in at the time, but her motive is unknown. Amidst the drama, Jane gave her foster sister a poison, and she subsequently passed away. These kinds of crimes carried on for several years, until something finally clicked in 1901. A patient named Maddie Davis visited with Jane at her home and suddenly passed away under a mysterious circumstance. After that, Jane weaseled her way into the Davis family by moving in with Maddie's husband and their children. Over the course of a few weeks, Jane took the lives of every family member by injecting poison into their systems. This huge kill was finally enough to capture investigators' attention. Jane was brought in and confessed to the crimes, while also admitting that she was the evil one behind at least 31 mysterious cases in the area of poisoning ill people. Some of those victims were confirmed, but many of them remained unsolved or overlooked by investigators at the time. It was a relief to finally have Jane off the streets and away from the innocent lives she could very well continue to take. She faced trial, and despite her confessions, she was found not guilty due to insanity. She lived out the rest of her years in an insane asylum. When asked about her crimes, she stated that she wanted to have claimed the lives of more people, helpless people, than any other man or woman who lived. Number 1. Harold Shipman from Britain was a medical practitioner that took lives during his career. After he was caught, he was labeled as a serial killer and is considered one of the most prolific in Britain's history. Nothing in Harold's childhood seemed to directly correspond to his later crimes. However, he did lose his mother to terminal cancer when he was only 17. It's believed that this was when Harold took an interest in the medical field. It seemed that he was eager to help those like his mother and wanted what was in the best interest of his patients. Obviously, that assumption later turned out to be false when word surfaced of the horrors. In his youth, Harold was a talented athlete and star student during both high school and his stay at a higher learning institute. He started a family in 1966 and held himself up as the all-American working man. He graduated from Leeds School of Medicine in 1970 and began a series of positions at various health institutes. Investigators say that there was no surefire way to determine when and where Harold's crimes began. At some point in his career, he caught the attention of his local undertaker, who grew suspicious when he noticed that Harold's patients were commonly admitted with good health, only to pass on a short time later. The undertaker also noticed the similar manner in which many of his patients were found, as though the scene had been set up on purpose. Harold brushed off the accusation and assured the undertaker that there was nothing to worry about. Shortly after this, however, a colleague of Harold's, Dr. Susan Booth, also raised eyebrows to the situation. This time, Harold was not personally confronted by the suspicious. Instead, Dr. Booth contacted the local coroner to alert them of the strange events unfolding. The tip was shared with local police, and an investigation against Harold was ignited. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence at the time to prove that Harold was taking lives. Harold was able to hide the truth for an extensive period. Although he was under the watchful eye of the law, he managed to continue his dirty work. There was never enough proof against him until one young woman took a chance. Kathleen Grundy was 81 years old when she was discovered no longer alive. Her remains were found sitting up in her living room in June of 1998. Harold had been at Kathleen's home in the hours surrounding the passing. He explained that she passed as a result of old age and insisted that no autopsy needed to be performed. Kathleen's daughter, Angela Woodruff, didn't accept this lie and sought to bring justice in her mother's case. Angela's doubt centered around the fact that her mother was in good health before she passed away, making the supposed cause very unlikely. She also found that a secondary and updated will had been created while her mother was in Harold's care. As it turns out, Harold had forged a new will that excluded Kathleen's family and left a handsome lump sum of cash to himself. Kathleen's body was exhumed, and an autopsy showed that she passed on after overdosing on heroin, allegedly provided to her by Harold. Pieces started to fall together, and the case against Harold was quickly organized. The investigation showed that Harold had as many as 250 victims, mostly elderly women. He was found guilty of 15 of those cases and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.